On March 23, 2008, a seemingly normal family in Iowa City attended Easter Mass just like any other Sunday. Stephen Sueppel, a well-respected banker, sat alongside his wife Cheryl and their 4 young children, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor. But by the next morning, their lives would be shattered. In a devastating turn of events, Stephen ended the lives of his entire family before driving his minivan into a concrete pillar at high speed, ending his own life. What could possibly drive a father to commit such a horrific act? The answer lies not just in the bloodshed, but in the secret life Stephen was desperately trying to hide. The Sueppel family appeared to be the picture of suburban tranquility in Iowa City. Stephen Sueppel, a 42-year-old vice president at Hills Bank and Trust, had built a respectable career in the small town. To most, he was a model employee, disciplined, hardworking, and deeply ingrained in the community. His wife Cheryl was just as devoted to their family. Together, they had 4 adopted children, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor, whom they cherished deeply. They had faced their own struggles with infertility before deciding to adopt, and their family was their pride and joy. Their home life seemed stable, even idyllic. They were the type of family that could be seen on any given Sunday attending Mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where they were active members. Cheryl, an attentive and nurturing mother, was the heart of the household. Ethan, 10, and Seth, 9, were playful, curious boys, while Mira, 5, and Eleanor, just 3, were bright-eyed and full of energy. The Sueppel children, like any other, were full of potential, their futures shining bright ahead of them. At church, Stephen and Cheryl were well-liked. They were friendly and approachable, involved in their local parish activities, and considered pillars of their community. Outside of church, their neighbors often saw the family working in their yard, taking walks, or enjoying quiet time together. To those who knew them, the Sueppels seemed to embody the values of hard work, faith, and family. There was no hint of the deep strain lying just beneath the surface. Yet, despite the image they projected to the world, behind closed doors, the Sueppels were living under an immense and growing weight. In early 2008, Stephen found himself at the center of a brewing storm. A criminal investigation that would soon unravel everything. The bright facade of his life was built on a deeply unsettling foundation. For months, Stephen had been embezzling money from the bank where he worked. His role as vice president allowed him to manipulate accounts, divert funds, and launder money, funneling a staggering sum of over $500,000 into personal accounts. It wasn't until a whistleblower at the bank brought the matter to light that the full scope of his actions became clear. While Stephen tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy at home, the weight of his impending legal troubles began to take a significant toll on him. The embezzlement charges were serious, federal charges that could mean years in prison. But it wasn't just his career and freedom at stake. It was his family. Stephen had been hiding this secret from Cheryl, who had no idea that her husband was facing criminal charges. The stress of the situation, combined with the fear of losing everything, his job, his home, his family, began to eat away at Stephen's mental state. The man who once appeared confident and composed began to crack. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Stephen had become increasingly withdrawn, irritable, and anxious. Yet, to his family, he continued to maintain the facade of a loving father and husband. He carried on as usual, never letting on to anyone just how close to the edge he really was. His children still looked up to him as a steady, loving figure. His wife still believed in the life they had built together, unaware of the storm that was rapidly approaching. In February 2008, Stephen was officially indicted on federal charges for embezzling $559,040 from Hills Bank. He was placed on bond while awaiting trial, but the weight of the charges hung over him like a shadow, a constant reminder of how everything he had worked for was slipping away. He had once been a respected member of the community, but now he was facing the possibility of prison and the destruction of his family's future. As the days went by, the pressure became unbearable. To outsiders, the Sueppel family still seemed to have it all. They showed up to church every Sunday, participated in community events, and appeared to be the epitome of middle-class happiness. But inside the walls of their home, things were rapidly falling apart. Stephen's financial troubles had become an obsession. His every thought was consumed with the looming trial and the growing possibility of prison. He had no way of hiding from the truth anymore. The life he had built, his reputation, and his family's security were all on the line. Stephen became more erratic, more volatile. The tension at home grew palpable, but no one outside of the family knew the extent of it. Cheryl, for all her love and dedication to her family, was in the dark. She had no idea that the man she had spent years with was on the verge of a breakdown. She never suspected that behind Stephen's calm exterior, he was already planning something unfathomable. Despite the cracks in their perfect life, Stephen and Cheryl carried on as usual in public. They attended Easter Mass together on March 23, 2008, along with their 4 children. Their church community saw nothing unusual. There were no signs of distress, no outward indication that something was deeply wrong. They sat together in the pew like any other family and listened to the Mass. It seemed like an ordinary Sunday, a peaceful day to celebrate the holiday, but it would be the last day the Sweppel family would ever be the same. In the hours after Mass, the Sweppels returned home. Inside, the house appeared calm, like nothing had changed. But as the night went on, Stephen's mind was racing, consumed with fear, guilt, and the overwhelming pressure of his actions catching up with him. He had reached a breaking point, and by the morning, the Sweppel family's life would be irreparably destroyed. The tragic events that unfolded next were not just the result of financial ruin or a broken man. They were the tragic consequence of years of secrecy, betrayal, and an unimaginable choice that would devastate the people he loved most. Stephen Supple was a man who appeared to have everything anyone could want: a successful career, a beautiful family, and the respect of those around him. He worked as a vice president and controller at Hills Bank and Trust Company in Hills, Iowa, a small, tightly knit town where everyone knew each other. He was well regarded by his colleagues, friends, and neighbors. His life seemed to be a model of American success, but in the months leading up to the tragic events of March 23, 2008, there were cracks forming in this seemingly perfect life. The truth was, Stephen's world was crumbling in ways no one could see. Beneath the surface of his picture-perfect existence, Stephen was facing an enormous secret, a secret that would soon destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. In early 2008, Stephen was indicted on federal charges of embezzling an astounding $559,040 from the bank where he had worked for over a decade. This was no small mistake or lapse in judgment. Stephen had carefully orchestrated the transfer of funds from the bank into a personal account that he had hidden from his superiors. He had done this over a period of time, slowly siphoning off money, each transaction a step further into the web of deception he had spun. The scale of the theft was staggering, and it became clear that he had used his position at the bank to cover his tracks, all while leading a life that appeared unremarkable to those around him. The indictment sent shockwaves through the local community, especially as it was revealed that Stephen had embezzled the funds while seemingly living a normal life. At the same time, his colleagues at the bank were left to wonder how they had missed the signs. The case quickly garnered the attention of the media, and Stephen's image as a respected banker was shattered. But for Stephen, this was more than just a legal problem. It was the collapse of everything he had built over the years. His reputation, his family's security, and his freedom were all at stake. Despite the gravity of the situation, Stephen remained outwardly calm, even as the walls of his world began to close in around him. He was granted bail pending his trial, which was scheduled for the following months. But it wasn't just the embezzlement charges that haunted him. The truth was that Stephen felt cornered. The pressure was mounting, and the inevitable consequences of his actions seemed impossible to escape. His life, once filled with promise, was now filled with fear and dread. He would spend hours at home, alone, thinking about what would happen if his crime came to light. He could see the headlines in his mind, the shame of having to explain his actions to his wife, his children, and his friends. And then, the thought of losing everything he had worked for, his career, his reputation, his family, was too much to bear. It wasn't just about the embezzled money anymore. It was about the complete unraveling of his life. As the trial date approached, Stephen's mental state grew more fragile. Despite being out on bail, he was carrying the heavy burden of his guilt. The stress, the fear of being caught, and the impending judgment began to wear him down. His wife, Cheryl, and their children were unaware of the danger that lurked just beneath the surface of their lives. They had no idea that Stephen's actions would soon have catastrophic consequences for their family. But while Stephen's world was imploding, he kept up appearances. He continued to go about his daily life, attending church with his family, interacting with his colleagues, and engaging in his usual routine. On the outside, he looked like the same man he had always been, a father, a husband, a respected professional. But inside, he was unraveling. The thought of what was to come, the legal battles, the prison time, the public disgrace, became too overwhelming to cope with. And in his mind, there seemed to be no way out. What many didn't know was that Stephen was also struggling with deep personal issues. The financial stress, combined with the guilt of his embezzlement and the impending threat to his family's future, was taking its toll on him. He began to withdraw from those closest to him, becoming distant, almost unreachable. He was slipping into a psychological state that clouded his judgment and pushed him into an unimaginable course of action. In the final weeks before the murders, Stephen's thoughts turned darker. He began to contemplate not just the financial fallout from his crime, but the devastation it would cause to his wife and children. He couldn't bear the thought of them facing the consequences of his actions. He couldn't bear the idea of his children being taunted at school or his wife being publicly humiliated. In his mind, there was no way out. The only solution seemed to be to erase the problem entirely by ending his family's lives. But that decision wasn't made in a vacuum. It was the culmination of months, even years of stress, fear, guilt, and a deteriorating mental state. Stephen Supple, once a man of dignity and respect, had fallen so far into the depths of despair that the unimaginable became the only way forward. And on the night of March 23, 2008, Stephen made a fateful decision, one that would devastate his family, his community, and everyone who knew him. The life he had built was about to come crashing down, and with it, the lives of those he loved the most. The night of March 23, 2008, began like any other for the Supple family. Stephen and Cheryl, along with their 4 children, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor, attended Easter Mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Iowa City. The family, well known in their community, sat together in their pew, appearing like any other family enjoying a quiet Sunday. There was no indication that the evening would take a horrific turn just hours later. For those who saw them at Mass, it seemed like just another family night. But behind the closed doors of their home, a tragedy was unfolding that no one could have imagined. After returning from Mass, Stephen's actions took an unsettling shift. While the family settled in, Stephen remained distant, retreating into his thoughts. What was once a loving husband and father was now a man burdened by an unbearable weight. Weeks earlier, Stephen had been indicted for embezzling over $559,000 from Hills Bank and Trust, where he worked as a vice president and controller. As the investigation into his actions had escalated, the man who had once been trusted by his colleagues was now a criminal, facing charges that would destroy both his professional and personal life. But this wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about the financial ruin he faced as a result of his crimes. There was something more that had been festering beneath the surface for weeks, something that had driven Stephen to the edge of insanity. He had spent his last few days in turmoil, knowing that the consequences of his actions were inevitable. His life, as he knew it, was crumbling. His family, who had no idea about the full extent of his crimes, was about to face an unimaginable horror. As the night wore on, Stephen did something strange. He left a series of frantic, apologetic voicemails. He called several people, former coworkers, relatives, and left them emotional messages, apologizing for actions he hadn't fully revealed. To anyone who would listen, he expressed deep regret, but left it unclear exactly what he was sorry for. And yet, that was just the beginning of his descent into madness. Inside their home, Stephen was preparing for the unthinkable. He went to his kitchen and scribbled down a note, a confession of sorts, but one that would leave even more questions in its wake. The note was short, chilling, and blunt. It spoke of the carnage he had already caused, the murder of his wife Cheryl and their 4 children, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor. But what was even more unsettling was the fact that Stephen didn't just plan to kill his family, he had planned to kill himself too. With the note in place, Stephen picked up 2 baseball bats, each one the tool of his unimaginable crime. He entered the rooms where his family lay sleeping, and in the dead of night, without warning, he brutally attacked them. The details of the violence remain harrowing and difficult to comprehend. He struck his wife first, Cheryl, who had no chance to fight back. Then he turned to his children, each one defenseless, as they too fell victim to their father's madness. By the time the bloodied chaos had settled, Stephen had murdered all 5 of them, his own flesh and blood, in an act of unimaginable violence. But Stephen's madness didn't end there. After the horrific act, he did something peculiar. He called 911. This wasn't a typical emergency call, though. There was no plea for help, no attempt to explain what had happened. Stephen called, but when the dispatcher answered, he hung up. It was as if he wanted to make sure someone would find the bodies, but wasn't ready to face what he had done. What was he thinking in those moments? Was he hoping for someone to stop him, to intervene? Or was it simply a last-ditch effort to make sure his family's deaths would not go unnoticed? Minutes after the call, police arrived at the scene, but by then it was too late. The carnage was already discovered. The bodies of Cheryl and their 4 children sprawled across the house in a gruesome display. Authorities found the 2 baseball bats, the tools of this gruesome act, left carelessly at the scene, a haunting symbol of the violence that had taken place. Stephen was not there when the police arrived, though. His actions weren't done. As the investigation began, Stephen's whereabouts were unknown. The police knew one thing: he had driven away from the scene, and his actions were far from over. But what they didn't know was that Stephen was now on his way to his final, devastating act. Stephen had driven to his family's minivan. There, in a final burst of desperation, he sped off. At 6:36 a.m., just 5 minutes after the 911 call, Stephen's minivan slammed into a concrete abutment on Interstate 80. The force of the impact was so severe that the vehicle exploded upon impact, bursting into flames. Stephen, in his final moment, had taken his own life, ending a legacy of horror with one last act of destruction. But why? What led him to this? In the aftermath of the tragedy, questions poured in from all sides. What pushed Stephen to kill his family? Was it the stress from his crimes? Was it something deeper, something far more hidden in the darkness of his mind? And how could someone so outwardly respectable, so seemingly normal, commit such an incomprehensible act? As the smoke from the crash cleared, the full scope of Stephen Supple's horror began to sink in. What had started as a quiet Easter Sunday, a simple family tradition, had ended in an act of unthinkable violence. What remained was a story of a family lost, and a man who took everything, including his own life, in an irreversible act of rage and despair. But behind it all, beneath the horror, was a tragic and complex story that still leaves many unanswered questions. For those who knew the Supples, it was a nightmare come to life. The man they had trusted, the father they thought they knew, was capable of such horrors. The twist was not only in the violence, but in the utter lack of warning. How did this seemingly quiet, respectable man become the perpetrator of such a horrific tragedy? The answer was as complex as it was chilling, but the fact remained: the Swepple family was gone, and Stephen had sealed their fate with his own hands in the most brutal of ways. The community would never be the same again, and the tragedy left lingering questions. What went on behind closed doors? What could have been done to prevent such an unimaginable act? And why did Stephen do it? The answers, as we would soon learn, were far more tragic than anyone could have anticipated. The news of the Swepple family massacre spread like wildfire across Iowa City, sending shockwaves through the community. What began as an ordinary Sunday morning quickly transformed into a devastating tragedy that no one could have seen coming. The neighborhood, where Stephen and Cheryl had raised their 4 children, was filled with families who had watched the Swepples grow, gone to church with them, and seen them around town. Now, the same people were left to comprehend the unspeakable, the brutal slaying of an entire family by someone who had seemed, by all accounts, perfectly ordinary. The Swepple family, once a beacon of normalcy, became the center of a crime that left everyone questioning how it could happen. Local news outlets raced to report the details, and as the coverage grew, so did the confusion. With each new update, the mystery deepened. How could a man like Stephen, a seemingly successful banker and devoted father, be capable of such violence? Neighbors recalled his friendly demeanor and the quiet life they led. He had been known to walk his children to school, share smiles with passers-by, and attend church on Sundays with his wife and kids. To the outside world, the Swepples were just like any other family, loving, close-knit, and dependable. No one ever suspected that beneath the surface a storm was brewing, one that would end with the brutal murder of everyone Stephen held dear. The community's reaction was one of disbelief, but also a deep sense of confusion. People wanted to understand, how did someone they trusted, someone who had been part of their daily lives, turn into a monster overnight? The man who had walked down the street with his children, laughing and chatting with his wife, was now the man who had murdered them in cold blood. But no answers could come quickly enough, and it seemed like no one had any idea how to make sense of it all. The questions just kept coming. Was it financial pressure, mental illness, a breakdown in Stephen's life that no one had seen coming? As the tragedy began to sink in, the grief over the Supples' deaths became all-consuming. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered in small groups, trying to piece together what had happened and why. But with each passing hour, the hole left by the Supples' deaths only seemed to grow larger. The story wasn't just one of murder. It was a devastating reminder that things aren't always as they seem. The community had been blindsided. People who had been neighbors for years suddenly realized that they never really knew Stephen at all. He had been hiding something much darker beneath the surface, something that no one could have possibly guessed. The emotional toll on the community was undeniable. It wasn't just the loss of a family, it was the loss of an illusion, the shattering of a once quiet neighborhood where everyone believed they knew their neighbors. There was a collective sense of betrayal and disbelief. The very thought that such a horrific crime could occur in their midst was hard to accept. How could they have missed the signs? How could they have not seen the warning signs in Stephen's actions before it was too late? In the days following the murders, Iowa City was engulfed in a deep collective mourning. The Supples were mourned not only by their immediate family, but by the entire town, as they were such an integral part of the community. People who had once shared smiles and casual conversations with Stephen and Cheryl at local stores, parks, and church now found themselves struggling to reconcile the loving couple they thought they knew with the horrific reality of their deaths. Their children too, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor, were remembered fondly, their lives cut short in a senseless and incomprehensible way. The funeral service was held just days later at St. Mary's Catholic Church, the same church the Supples had attended for years. The church, like the rest of the town, was filled with grief and sorrow, but there was also controversy that followed in its wake. The question on everyone's mind was, should Stephen Supple, the man who had taken the lives of his wife and children, be allowed to be part of the service? Should he be mourned alongside the victims of his brutal actions? Some felt that despite his crimes, he was still a father, and his death should not be dismissed entirely. Others, however, felt that his actions were so unforgivable that he should be excluded from any recognition. It was a tense and difficult debate, one that divided the community and sparked fierce arguments among those who had once been united in their love for the Supples. For many, the controversy surrounding Stephen's inclusion in the funeral mass only deepened the sense of tragedy. How could anyone honor a man who had done such an unspeakable thing? The tension at the service was palpable as people struggled with their conflicting emotions. Should the focus remain solely on the innocent victims, or should the family as a whole be remembered in their entirety, flaws and all? Despite the controversy, the entire town felt the weight of the loss. Memorials, flowers, and messages of condolence were left outside the church, at local businesses, and at the Suepels' home. Iowa City, once a place of safety and calm, was now forever marked by the violence that had struck its heart. The sense of community, once so strong, now seemed fragile and fractured, as residents grappled with their grief and confusion. As local authorities worked tirelessly to piece together the events leading up to the killings, the town waited anxiously for answers. How could Stephen Supple, a man who had been well-liked, respected, and trusted by so many, become capable of such horror? What could have led him to kill his wife and children, then end his own life in a final desperate act? The community could only watch as the investigation unfolded, hoping that someday they would have the answers they so desperately needed. But even as the town sought closure, the impact of the murders lingered. The Supples' deaths were not just a family tragedy. They were a reminder that no one can truly know what lies beneath the surface of someone's life. What appeared to be a happy, well-adjusted family was, in reality, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The Supple family massacre would remain etched in the memories of the people of Iowa City for years to come, a haunting reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the horrors that can emerge from the most unexpected places. When the dust settled after the horrific events of March 23, 2008, the aftermath was just beginning to unfold. For those left behind, the pain of the loss was only compounded by the financial and legal complications that followed. Hills Bank and Trust, where Steven Supple had worked as a vice president and controller, was left to deal with the ramifications of both his embezzlement and the brutal murders that rocked the community. As the family was laid to rest, the bank was now forced to contend not only with the loss of a trusted employee, but also with the staggering financial toll Steven's actions had caused. Hills Bank's next move was inevitable. Legal documents were filed, seeking to recover the stolen funds from Steven's estate. But the situation was far from simple. Steven's death had left his estate in limbo, with the tragic loss of his family members and the mounting debts to the bank. While the bank sought to recover the money Steven had embezzled, it was unclear how much could be salvaged from the wreckage. Much of the stolen money had likely been used to cover up his fraudulent activities, and now, with Steven dead and his assets frozen, there was little to work with. The complexity of the estate meant that the legal battles dragged on for months. The Supple family, already devastated by the brutal murders, now found themselves trapped in a web of financial disputes. The estate was tied up in probate, with creditors, including Hills Bank, filing claims for the repayment of the stolen money. But the estate was in disarray. Much of Steven's personal wealth had been squandered, leaving the family with few assets to fight for. As the legal wrangling continued, it became clear that there was no easy solution. The financial damage wasn't limited to the Supple family's estate. Hills Bank itself, once a stable institution, now had to deal with the enormous reputational cost of having been involved in a scandal that had led to murder. The community that had once trusted the bank, where Steven had been a well-respected figure, now viewed the institution with suspicion. There were public outcries and concerns about how such a large-scale fraud could go undetected for so long. The bank had failed to recognize the signs of Steven's embezzlement in time, and this failure weighed heavily on its leadership. With public trust eroded, the bank had to take significant steps to repair its image. Steps that, while necessary, could not undo the damage done. In the months that followed, the local media kept the story alive, exposing the financial destruction caused by Steven's actions. Stories of the family's tragic end were paired with the details of the financial mismanagement that led to it, creating a narrative that intertwined personal devastation with corporate failure. It was a chilling reminder of the consequences of unchecked financial crime and how, in this case, the victims weren't just the Supple family, but the community at large. The complexity of Steven's estate only deepened as the legal battles wore on. The family's survivors, extended relatives, and close friends were left to navigate a maze of financial and legal paperwork while trying to come to terms with the unimaginable loss. They had to contend with the fallout of Steven's actions without the comfort of knowing that there was any real justice to be served. The legal system was focused on retrieving the embezzled funds, but the emotional scars would never heal. Hills Bank, despite its efforts to recover the stolen funds, ultimately found itself caught in a web of moral and financial damage. The scandal surrounding the embezzlement affected more than just its reputation. It altered the trajectory of the lives of many who had been touched by the Supple tragedy. The survivors, the employees of the bank, and the community members who once looked up to Steven now had to reconcile with the darker truths that had been hidden behind closed doors. For the bank, the financial and legal aftermath was only part of the story. The personal toll, however, was just as devastating. The families of the employees who had worked with Steven were left to grapple with the loss of a colleague they thought they knew. Trust had been shattered on multiple levels, and for the community of Iowa City, there was no way to return to the innocence they had once known. The Supple family's tragedy had shaken them to their core, and the repercussions would last far beyond the courtroom. The question remained, how much could really be recovered? With each passing month, it became clear that the true cost of Steven's actions extended far beyond the money he stole. His actions had destroyed a family, torn apart a community, and left a bank scrambling to salvage its reputation. In the end, no amount of legal action could undo the devastation left in the wake of his crimes. The financial recovery was slow and uncertain, but the emotional cost, both for his surviving relatives and for the community, was irreversible. The legacy of Steven Supple was no longer that of a respected banker, but but that of a man whose desperate actions had forever altered the course of so many lives. And as the legal battles continued to unfold, those who had been left behind were forced to come to terms with the painful reality that some scars cannot be healed by financial restitution. The emotional and societal impact of the tragedy would echo through Iowa City for years to come. Stephen Supple's descent into madness did not happen overnight. It was a slow, painful unraveling of a man under intense psychological strain, masked by a veneer of normalcy. On the surface, Stephen appeared to be living the American dream, a well-educated, successful banker, a devoted husband, and a father to 4 young children. But behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding, one filled with mounting pressure, shame, and fear. His life was slowly consumed by the weight of his own actions, and as the days passed, it became clearer that Stephen's breaking point was fast approaching. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Stephen had been living a double life. By day, he was the picture of professionalism, overseeing financial matters at Hills Bank and Trust. But behind the polished exterior, Stephen was involved in a major embezzlement scheme, diverting over $500,000 from the bank into his own account. The fraud was carefully concealed, making it difficult for anyone to notice at first. However, when the authorities caught wind of it in early 2008, the walls began to close in around Stephen. He was indicted on charges of embezzlement and money laundering, a reality that threatened to unravel his entire life. Psychologists who have studied cases like Stephen's suggest that financial stress, particularly the kind Stephen was facing, can have devastating psychological effects. Money isn't just about bills or living standards. It's deeply tied to a person's sense of identity, stability, and self-worth. As a banker, Stephen had built his life around the idea of financial control and success. His career was his lifeline. When that lifeline was threatened by the prospect of prison and public humiliation, his world began to crumble. The shame of being exposed for his deceit must have been overwhelming. The fear of losing everything, not just professionally but personally, must have seemed insurmountable. As the reality of his legal situation set in, Stephen's mental state began to deteriorate. While his family remained unaware of the gravity of his financial troubles, Stephen was secretly drowning. He had hoped that he could evade justice, but with each passing day the pressure mounted. The idea of public disgrace, the thought of what his wife and children might think if they learned the truth, became unbearable. His anxiety about facing the consequences of his actions started to seep into his everyday life. But rather than seek help, Stephen retreated further into his isolation, consumed by his own guilt and fear. What psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises from holding 2 contradictory beliefs or attitudes, likely played a major role in Stephen's downfall. On one hand, Stephen believed himself to be a good man, a family man, who loved his wife and children. On the other hand, his embezzlement was an act of dishonesty that betrayed his own values. This internal conflict created a psychological fracture that became too much to bear. As the financial strain worsened and the impending trial loomed large, Stephen may have convinced himself that there was no way out, that he could not face the world as a failure. His actions leading up to the murders suggest that he had planned his escape, not just from the legal ramifications, but from his own psychological torment. The voicemail messages he left behind in the hours before the killings, apologizing to co-workers, friends, and family members, serve as a chilling indication of his state of mind. They were his last attempts to make amends, to seek forgiveness, even though he knew that the harm he was about to cause was irreparable. But these messages were also a reflection of a man who knew he was losing control, a man who couldn't stop himself from spiraling further into darkness. In the final moments before the murders, Stephen's psychological state was clearly fractured. It wasn't just the fear of being caught, it was the crushing weight of guilt, shame, and despair. The very person he had spent years pretending to be, the man who had built his life on the foundation of respectability and success, was now the villain of his own tragic story. And in his mind, the only way to restore some semblance of control was through violent, irreversible actions. Stephen's decision to kill his family was a twisted act of control, a misguided attempt to shield them from the consequences of his own actions. Perhaps he saw it as a way to spare them from the shame he felt he was bringing upon them. But what makes this case particularly chilling is that Stephen's violence wasn't driven by a sudden, uncontrollable rage. Instead, it was the culmination of months, if not years, of internal turmoil. a psychological breakdown in which Stephen seemed to lose sight of everything that had once mattered to him. The bludgeoning of his wife and children with baseball bats, followed by his final act of suicide, shows a man who had already checked out mentally and emotionally. His final act of driving into that concrete pillar with such speed and force revealed a man who had completely severed himself from reality. This was not the act of someone who had simply snapped in the heat of the moment. This was the act of a man who had made a cold, calculated decision, one that had been building up for some time. What ultimately becomes clear is that Stephen Supple's psychological state was severely fractured by his own actions. The embezzlement, the guilt, the fear of exposure, all of it built up inside him, transforming him from a respected banker to a man who believed that there was no way out. The tragedy of his family's deaths was not just a consequence of financial crimes, but a tragic reminder of how unchecked mental health struggles, financial stress, and internal conflict can collide with devastating results. In the end, Stephen's story serves as a haunting example of how the weight of secrets, shame, and fear can slowly erode a person's sense of self until there is nothing left but a dangerous and deadly break from reality. The tragic deaths of the Suepple family raise critical ethical questions about the way we, as a society, consume and report true crime stories. As viewers, we are often drawn to the details, the shocking acts of violence, the motivations behind them, and the investigation that follows. But in the case of the Suepple family massacre, there's a larger ethical conversation that often gets overlooked. What happens when the gruesome reality of a crime is magnified to satisfy public curiosity? How does this relentless coverage impact the families involved? The media's role in sensationalizing these tragedies has long been a point of contention. The Suepple murders were no exception. After the bodies were discovered and the details of the family's deaths became public, the news outlets quickly picked up the story, focusing on the gruesome details. The bludgeoning of Cheryl and the children with baseball bats, Stephen's suicide, the shocking 911 call he made. It was the kind of story that gripped the nation, with headlines that seemed to grab attention at every turn. But at what cost? While these details may captivate audiences, they risk reducing a tragic human story to a mere spectacle. The victims, Cheryl and her children, become secondary to the tragedy of the man who killed them, a man whose crimes overshadow their lives. This is a pattern seen time and again in true crime media. The focus on the perpetrator often leaves little room to fully consider the depth of loss felt by the surviving family members, the community, and even those who may have known Stephen as a colleague or neighbor. Behind the headlines and sensationalized reports are people who are deeply affected by these crimes. The ethical questions surrounding this case go beyond just the media's portrayal. When it came time to lay the Suepple family to rest, the decision to include Stephen in the funeral mass raised significant debate. St. Mary's Catholic Church in Iowa City decided to honor all 6 members of the family during the service, even though Stephen was the one responsible for their deaths. The Catholic Church, adhering to its teachings on forgiveness, offered a mass that included Stephen alongside his wife and children. While this decision was rooted in the principles of mercy and the idea that all people are deserving of forgiveness, it struck many as deeply uncomfortable. Should a murderer, regardless of their reasons, they afforded the same respect and dignity in death as the victims they killed. The inclusion of Stephen in the mass created a rift within the community, with some seeing it as an act of compassion and others as a morally troubling gesture that seemed to erase the horror of what he had done. For many, the decision to treat Stephen as part of the family in death seemed to diminish the significance of the lives lost. Cheryl and the children had no say in the matter, their lives reduced to a tragedy that was part of a larger narrative about the failure of a father to meet the pressures of life. In trying to offer forgiveness, did the church risk disrespecting the memory of those who were killed? And was the media, in its own way, complicit in this by feeding into the narrative of Stephen's fall from grace, rather than focusing on the real victims of this crime? This ethical dilemma forces us to question our role as consumers of true crime content. What happens when our curiosity crosses the line into exploitation? How can we ensure that, in our search for answers and understanding, we don't lose sight of the humanity of those involved? We must ask ourselves, how do we reconcile our need to understand these horrors with the recognition that there are real people at the center of these stories? people who are left to pick up the pieces after the cameras stop rolling. The public's fascination with this case, and others like it, raises another important question. How does this constant exposure to true crime stories affect us as individuals and as a society? There's a fine line between understanding the psychology behind these crimes and commodifying the pain and suffering of others. The more we consume these stories, the more we become numb to the tragedy they represent. What was once a story about real people, a family, a community, is eventually reduced to nothing more than a chilling headline. And this becomes a cycle that continues as new cases are brought to light and the public's attention shifts, often without giving the victims the respect and space they deserve. At its core, the story of the Suepel family massacre serves as a stark reminder that true crime is not just a genre for entertainment. It's a reflection of the darker sides of humanity and the ethical responsibility that comes with telling these stories. The people involved are not just characters in a tragedy, they are real individuals who lived, loved, and were loved, and their loss must be treated with the respect it deserves. It's essential for us, as consumers of this content, to take a step back and consider the impact of our fascination. While it's natural to be drawn to the details of these tragedies, we must never forget the lives behind them. As we continue to explore the mysteries of true crime, it's important to reflect on how we approach these stories. The line between empathy and exploitation is thin, and it's crucial to approach these cases with respect for both the victims and those who remain to live with the consequences. The story of the Suepel family is a cautionary tale, not just of a family destroyed by violence, but of the ethical challenges we face in how we understand and engage with these real-life horrors. The story of Steven Suepel and his family is not just a tragedy. It's a chilling reminder of the deep, hidden struggles that many face behind closed doors. Struggles that can have catastrophic consequences if left unchecked. The deaths of Cheryl and their 4 young children, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor, are heartbreaking, but they also expose critical lessons about the dangers of ignoring financial pressures, mental health struggles, and the warning signs that often go unnoticed by friends, family, and even professionals. But the story doesn't end with the murders. It's the aftermath of this tragedy that offers crucial lessons for all of us. For one, the Suepel case underscores the importance of paying attention to signs of distress in people we care about. Often, when someone is going through a financial crisis or emotional turmoil, they don't show it openly. Instead, they may put on a brave face, hiding their true feelings. Steven didn't leave many outward signs of what was coming, but there were subtle clues. The erratic behavior, the apologies to coworkers and family, the strange voicemails he left. If someone had noticed these signs and reached out, the outcome might have been different. The lack of open communication, whether with a spouse, friends, or even a professional, can leave a person isolated in their struggles, feeling like there's no way out. This tragedy also highlights the consequences of neglecting mental health, particularly when financial stress is involved. Steven's mental and emotional decline was tied directly to the pressure he felt from his mounting debts, his job's responsibilities, and the impending legal consequences. It's crucial for communities to understand that financial strain, especially in cases of embezzlement or fraud, can lead to severe emotional distress. When people are unable to cope with these pressures, they may resort to drastic actions, especially if they feel backed into a corner. The Suepel family massacre also speaks to the importance of professional help and intervention. There was no indication that Steven ever sought mental health assistance for the deepening stress he was under. This case serves as a reminder of the need to encourage people to seek therapy, counseling, or other forms of support when they are struggling emotionally. If Steven had reached out to a therapist or financial advisor, perhaps there could have been a different outcome, a way to prevent the catastrophic path he chose. On a broader level, the case challenges our perceptions of people who commit such heinous acts. Steven wasn't a monster. He was a man, a father, someone who had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. His actions, though unforgivable, can't be fully understood without considering the internal and external pressures he faced. Financial pressures can be destructive when they build up in secret, unspoken ways. It's not just about money. It's about the emotional toll that financial failure can take. We need to start thinking more holistically about mental health and financial wellness in our communities, and how they are often linked together. We can also learn from the way this tragedy affected the community and the ripple effects it had. While the initial shock was profound, the aftermath showed just how long-lasting the impact of such a crime can be. The emotional toll on the community, especially on those who knew Stephen and his family, was immense. The case also opened up conversations about the consequences of financial crimes, not just for the perpetrator, but for the families involved. Hills Bank, where Stephen worked, had to deal with the fallout from his embezzlement, trying to recover the stolen funds while grappling with the public scrutiny. No one involved in this tragedy walked away unchanged. So, what can we take from this? First, we must advocate for open conversations about money, stress, and mental health, both within families and in the wider community. We need to foster an environment where people feel safe asking for help when they are overwhelmed, whether financially or emotionally. We also need better systems in place to identify warning signs before they lead to irreversible consequences. Whether it's noticing behavioral changes, offering a listening ear, or encouraging someone to seek help, small acts of awareness can make a life-saving difference. Finally, we must remember that the victims of this tragedy were not just names on a list. They were real people. Cheryl and their children had their own hopes, dreams, and futures, all tragically cut short. It's easy to get wrapped up in the drama of the case, but at the heart of it, we must honor their memory by learning from the circumstances that led to their untimely deaths and ensuring that similar tragedies are prevented in the future. But the Suepel family massacre teaches us that the invisible struggles of others can be far more destructive than we realize. Let's take these lessons to heart by being aware, by being supportive, and by making sure no one feels like they are alone in their darkest moments. For the family and friends left behind, healing is a slow process. The faces of the children, once filled with promise, are now immortalized in memories and photographs. As for Stephen, there are no simple answers. His actions remain a mystery that will never fully be understood. One thing, however, is clear. No amount of success or wealth could shield him from the darkness that ultimately consumed him. If you've ever wondered what can unravel a seemingly perfect life, this case is a chilling testament to the fact that no one truly knows the full story behind closed doors. For those who lost everything, and for the community that still feels the weight of this tragedy, the questions will never stop. How could it have happened? And was there any way to prevent it? If you've been affected by this story or have any thoughts on what drove Stephen Suepel to make such an irreversible decision, we want to hear from you. Please leave your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature.